This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, BioCentury's Washington Editor. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Craig Burton, Executive Director of the Biosimilars Council, a division of the Association for Accessible Medicines, a trade association representing manufacturers of generic and biosimilar drugs. When I think about biosimilars, I think of the advertising slogan of a chain of Mexican pharmacies, lo mismo pero más barato, the same but cheaper. That's the promise. Since the biosimilars pathway was created in the United States in 2010, FDA has approved 57 biosimilars, 41 are marketed, and they compete with 17 innovator biologics. More numbers. In 2023, savings from the use of biosimilars increased by more than 30% to $12.4 billion. That's the good news. On the other hand, by any measure, biosimilars haven't lived up to expectations. 80% of brand biologics that are eligible for competition do not have biosimilars in development. Even when there is a biosimilar that competes with an original biologic, the original drug often continues to have dominant market share. In the United States, average combined market share for biosimilars is about 20%. And that's before the Inflation Reduction Act kicks in. As we'll discuss today, an unintended consequence of the IRA's Medicare drug price negotiation program is that it creates new economic headwinds to biosimilar competition. So, Craig, let's start with the positive news. The Biosimilars Council's new report charts savings from biosimilars and increased access. What are the highlights?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So you touched on a couple of the highlights. I think the report speaks to the promise, speaks to what folks have hoped in biosimilars. It shows the savings, $12.4 billion in savings in 2023. But one of the stats that I get most excited about in there is what it means in terms of patient access. We've been tracking how many patients have used biosimilars, and it's been used in 2.7 billion days of patient therapy. But importantly, it has also resulted in almost 500 million days of patient therapy that would not have occurred without biosimilars. Simply put, if you look at what use of the molecule would have been without biosimilars in the market, you trend it forward and you compare it to what's happening now in almost every market where biosimilars are active, you see a range anywhere from 3 to 5% increase in patient adoption of that molecule. And that speaks to what everyone hoped for biosimilars was lower costs and greater patient access to care.
So that's all the good news, right?
Yeah.
Your report also talks about barriers that limit biosimilar development adoption, the regulatory burden and perverse incentives in the U.S. market that punish manufacturers for lower prices have bedeviled biosimilars from the start. But there's a new one. I alluded to it in my introduction, the Inflation Reduction Act. Congress included measures in the IRA that were intended to bolster biosimilars in the United States. But overall, the industry isn't a fan. What's the problem?
Yeah, so I think you're right. When you look at IRA as a whole, it is important to remember there are aspects of IRA that were intended to encourage biosimilar adoption. They included higher reimbursement for biosimilars for 5 years in the Medicare program. The redesign of the Medicare drug program is theoretically intended to encourage plans to utilize lower cost medicines. That said, first of all, we think that the Medicare redesign fell short. It leaves in place some of the incentives for the gross to net rebating games that we're seeing today. But more fundamentally, the price negotiation provisions of IRA create significant questions, significant uncertainty that will affect biosimilar development. Put simply, you now, if you're thinking about investing in a new biosimilar with cost of anywhere from $100 million to $300 million to develop a new biosimilar, now, on top of all the other questions you have to sort through, now you have to project what a negotiated price might be by the time you come to market. So you have to,
So, so I mean, so the idea basically biosimilar, to cut to the chase, generally speaking, a biosimilar provides about a 40% discount off of the list price. If that list price has been knocked down to below the net price, you're going to be having to compete. You're going to be having to give a discount, 40% or whatever it is, off of a price that's already been reduced. And that's for the first biosimilar. Presumably, if there's more biosimilars, that's going to knock the price down more. And so you don't know what you're going to be, you don't know what you're going to be doing, but there's a chance that there's really not going to be much of a margin there.
I think there's a very real chance, and there's absolutely no way of predicting what that will be, because you're making your investment decision years before that price is set by HHS through this price negotiation process.
So some people would look at it and say, so what? You know, the purpose of the biosimilar is to reduce the price. HHS is reducing the price for the healthcare system, for patients. Why do they care whether it's a biosimilar or the originator that's had the price reduced?
Yeah, I've heard that argument, and I think it's a little short-sighted. Two things with that. First of all, even if you concede, which I don't think I'm willing to, but if you were to concede for a moment that price negotiation is going to create greater savings than biosimilars, that's only going to benefit the Medicare program. So you're going to leave the entire commercial healthcare system with reduced incentives for biosimilars. I still think you'll have biosimilars. I just think they'll be slower to market, and you won't have as many of them on the market. But secondly, I think look, let's compare, for instance, the prices set by HHS that they announced a few weeks ago to what we see happening in the Humira market. We see biosimilar versions of Humira with price discounts of 86+%. That is far greater than anything that CMS achieved in its price negotiation. So we really do think generics biosimilars are a proven way to drive savings, and it simply makes more sense to us to focus on building on what's worked rather than what they've put in place here.
I want to come back to Humira later in the conversation, because I think it's really an interesting case study, really kind of a bellwether. But I've been watching the biosimilars industry since its inception, actually since before it even started. And one of the things that's really interesting is that I see anyone who gets involved with the industry at some point has two epiphanies, right? One of them is that lower prices of biosimilars don't translate to higher sales usually in the United States. In fact, it's the opposite. And that's because of rebating practices. And the second is that clinical trials of biosimilars rarely produce useful evidence. And that's counterintuitive for people who are used to the innovator industry. I want to take the first one. Why is it that when companies have lower prices for biosimilars, when you have a lower price biosimilar even competing with a higher price biosimilar, usually the higher price one is the one that's going to have the bigger market share?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think certainly in the retail, in the pharmacy benefit space, we've seen that with insulin, with Humira. But we've also seen similar dynamics in the medical benefit and the provider administered buy and bill space, where no surprise, but some work we did several years ago with IQVIA digging into what were the drivers in provider adoption. One of the key pieces was the relative reimbursement, and kind of that question of how much a provider was paying for the product, but also how much they were getting reimbursed. And depending on the product, there are some instances where providers are able to get reimbursed higher when they use the higher priced product.
Because they're getting a percentage of the list price as a kind of an add-on to as an incentive for using it. So they're incentivized to use the more expensive drug. The pharmacy benefit managers are incentivized to use a more expensive drug because they can extract a bigger rebate from that and either pocket it or use it for subsidizing premiums. So what's the policy solution to change that kind of perverse incentive?
Yeah, so I mean, you keyword is incentives, right? And what you have to do is go back and figure out, okay, how do we align the system to drive the behavior that we want to achieve? There are some hints of what that might look like. For instance, if you look at provider adoption of biosimilars, healthcare providers who participate in the oncology care model, for instance, are more likely to use biosimilars than those who are not. The oncology
and that's because it's capitated at a certain amount. They get a certain amount per patient, so they've got an incentive to use a less expensive options. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And so one thing you could do is create a shared savings program in the Medicare program where providers retain a portion of the savings that would otherwise accrue to the Medicare program when they use biosimilars. That's what Congress tried to do with the enhanced reimbursement in IRA. And I think that was a good first step, but I think there's some evidence suggesting that maybe that didn't fully do the trick.
Mm-hmm. So I think another part of it is the other side of the equation is there need to be steps taken to reduce the cost of developing biosimilars. We're going to take a quick break now. And when we come back, I'm going to talk to you about some ideas for what could be done to reduce the cost of developing biosimilars, and that would change the economics of the industry a bit.
This September in Nashville, BioCentury launches Grand Rounds, a new interdisciplinary R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia. Join BioCentury and a rich roster of innovators and key thought leaders to identify leading-edge discoveries and discuss urgent challenges that must be solved to translate these innovations into product development and medical practice. Meet academic innovators, physician scientists, early-stage investors, and biopharma R&D leaders for 2 days of networking, partnering, and debate. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm Steve Usdin, Washington Editor BioCentury. I'm back with Craig Burton, Director of the Biosimilars Council. I'd said just before the break that we were going to talk about measures that can be taken to reduce the cost of developing biosimilars, but I want to actually take a step back and talk about one other thing, which is Humira. It's kind of the poster child, both for the need for biosimilars and maybe also a poster child for the need for policy changes, right? There are 10 biosimilars approved in the United States for Humira. It took a long time, but finally, two out of the three PBMs that control most of the U.S. market are preferring biosimilars, but they're not necessarily preferring the least expensive biosimilars. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with Humira?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, but I think the core piece you spoke to is really the power of PBMs when it comes to driving adoption or not of new biosimilars, regardless of their price. I would actually take this story back to the insulins. We saw this begin. We were not surprised with what we've seen in the Humira market because we saw it play out in the insulin market, where a biosimilar insulin came to market with a price at a significant 60% discount. and the major PBMs did not pick it up. And in fact, when you looked at the prescriptions, we were able to dig into the prescriptions for the biosimilar insulin. And 2/3 of the prescriptions for that biosimilar were rejected by the PBMs, and who pushed patients over to the branded product. So with that as history, I don't think we've been surprised in what we've seen with Humira. So, you kind of indicated first year of Humira adoption, almost zero adoption by the big three PBMs after
of the biosimilar.
Of the biosimilar. Yeah. After 1 year, the biosimilar had 2% market share. And that was with prices anywhere from 50% lower list price to 85% lower list price.
And we're talking about a big market here. It's tens of billions of dollars a year. Yeah.
A market that is worth more than the National Football League in annual revenues. Yes. The adoption that we saw in that time was overwhelmingly by small PBMs, small health plans that were not dependent on rebates, that went for the lowest priced product. We've seen a shift in the last, I'd say, 6 months. You alluded to it. The big three PBMs have started to jump in, and CVS jumped in and is encouraging use of its preferred biosimilar. The other PBMs, big PBMs, appear to be doing the same or have announced plans to do the same. And the CVS experience through Cordavis is interesting to look at, because they were able to flip something like 80% of their utilization almost overnight. And
you mentioned Cordavis. That's kind of a house brand, right, for CVS. So they waited until they created a house brand, if you will, and then they shifted all of the use to that product.
Yeah, it is still one of the 9 original biosimilar manufacturers, but through an exclusive, or I don't know if it's exclusive, but through a co-branding approach that they've put together, where they're realizing some value on the sales of the products within their channel. It is really interesting when you look at where we stand today. Two things. First of all, when we looked at this earlier in the year, if in 2023 we had been able to switch all utilization to the biosimilars, patients and health plans would have saved $6 billion, but that would have come at a cost of $2 billion to the PBMs and to specialty pharmacy. So that tells you kind of why we are where we are today. But secondly, when you look at now with CVS, Cordavis, the other PBMs diving into this, that's good news for patients. Whether it will result in a long-term sustainable market, I think, is a separate question, and it's one that bears watching. But it really does just continue to speak to the primacy of the PBMs in driving adoption. The other interesting thing when you look at that is, in the time that you've had the biosimilar versions of Humira on the market, you've had actually more patients switched to newer branded products like Skyrizi and Rinvoq than switched to the biosimilar versions of Humira. And that also comes back to PBM formulary decisions.
That's a so-called product hopping.
It sounds like product hopping to me, and the brand manufacturer has been open about its efforts to move patients, and I think they've been very successful in that way.
So let's go to another part of the equation, which is reducing the cost of developing biosimilar. You mentioned costs of $100 million to as much as $300 million to develop a biosimilar, and that's dramatically out of line with what it costs, for example, to develop a generic version of a small molecule drug, which can be, $1 million or less. I think obviously it's never going to be as cheap to develop a biosimilar as it is to develop a small molecule, but it doesn't have to be that much money. What are some of the things that could be done safely to reduce the costs of developing biosimilars, and where do we stand in getting some of those things changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a start, you touched on it. The cost is an issue. Look, right now, if you look at the pipeline, and this is using publicly available data, so there may be products we don't know about, but something like 80+% of innovator biologics that could have a biosimilar competitor at some point do not have a biosimilar in the pipeline. And a lot of that comes back to that combination of the cost of development along with the possible value on the back end. FDA's, in fairness to FDA, they're doing a lot on this. They've been pumping out, truthfully, so many guidances lately that it's a little bit hard to keep them all straight. But in particular, their guidance around interchangeability and around where they're clarifying that they're not necessarily going to require clinical efficacy studies for biosimilars to demonstrate interchangeability.
Well, and let's talk about the interchangeability, because if that worked out the way that people would hope it would work out, it would address a lot of these problems, because there would be automatic substitutability at the pharmacy counter, at least for drugs that are delivered that way, distributed that way. What's your thoughts about the guidance? What's your thoughts about the prospect of interchangeability actually making a dent in the problems that we've been talking about?
So I think that interchangeability is certainly a part of the solution to what we've been talking about. I also don't think it's a must-have. I think if we go back and look at the experience to date, some of the biggest adopters of the biosimilar Humira adopted a non-interchangeable, and they were still able to work with patients to switch them. That said, does it make it easier? Certainly. I think interchangeability has been misunderstood by providers and by the public, and I think FDA has done a lot to try to address the confusion there. And I think that FDA has been clear that they're open to working with companies. The science has evolved to a point where I think they've even come out and said they would not be approving products as biosimilar if they were not comfortable with them being switched, with patients being switched back and forth, which is the core of what you're talking about with interchangeability.
And it's not only interchangeability with the reference product, but it's interchangeability of one biosimilar for another. Because technically, according to the law, if you get this interchangeability designation, that makes you interchangeable with the original product, but technically it's not with other biosimilars. But in fact, if you look at the European experience and you look at the reality, what happens with PBM formularies and so on, people switch back and forth
totally agree.
Frequently, and there isn't any documentation that there's any reason not to do that.
Totally agree. I think there are two things that I'm optimistic about in that area. One is, as I mentioned, I think the FDA is doing a lot of work there and is moving in a good direction. Secondly, and FDA is contributing to this, I think there's legislative interest in Congress in revisiting that interchangeability designation, and the FDA actually included in their budget proposal this year language, legislative proposal to remove the statutory distinction between interchangeable and biosimilar products. This would still give FDA they would still have the flexibility to determine a product is not interchangeable, but it would remove this artificial distinction that exists only in the U.S.
And we touched a few times also on clinical trials. I mean, the notion that a clinical trial and a biosimilar is going to yield actionable evidence,
right,
if you actually think about it, is really small. I mean, there are people who have said that it's not even ethical to ask people to participate in a clinical trial of a biosimilar because there's no reason to believe that it's either going to help the patient or
right,
generate useful scientific information. Do you think we could ever get to a place where FDA routinely approves biosimilars and has an expectation that it will do so without requiring clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly optimistic that we can get there. Hopefully soon. I think we know the science around biosimilars has evolved quickly, and we're now a far cry from where we were years ago when they first created the pathway for biosimilars. We can use analytical methods to identify differences, frankly, that you wouldn't identify through clinical trials. So yeah, I think the science is there. I think FDA has been very clear with sponsors. Bring us your ideas. Show us how you would do that separate from clinical studies. So I think those are conversations that are happening now, even. Yeah.
So last thing, I think we're kind of running up against time, but I wanted to ask you one other question, which is, a lot of the people, our kind of core audience for BioCentury are innovators. And I think a lot of innovators might look at this and say, well, biosimilars, who cares about it? But actually, the success of the biosimilar industry is really critical to innovators. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think that's exactly correct. I mean, I spent a good chunk of my career on the innovator side of the industry. I think if you look at the future of biosimilars, I think they are critical to the success of innovation in a couple ways. One, the savings you get from biosimilars can create headroom that allows for new therapies. Not only does it encourage new innovation, but it also allows the healthcare system to afford that new innovation. So I think the two go hand in hand, and I think if you look at the U.S., certainly with generics, you have a history of both innovation but also savings, and I think you have the possibility of a similar model with biosimilars.
Well, thanks a lot, Craig. Thanks for speaking with me, and let's talk again later and see, a year from now maybe, if any of the things that we've talked about have come to fruition, and if if there's more progress in actually meeting the rising to the occasion or meeting the expectations of the healthcare system for greater use and development and use of biosimilar.
Sounds great. Really appreciate you having me.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.